I think I've said this before, but I got into vinyl more seriously about a year and a half ago. And I feel like I'm hearing music from before the 1990s for the first time. Like there's just stuff in the recordings that I've never heard. Like I was telling Chris, like I was listening to some old Boston records I found that were like, I never thought of Boston as being particularly well recorded, or like, it's kind of like stadium rock music. And I heard
Nicholas, you mentioned
really
guilty pleasures at one point as an option. I think
yeah.
Boston might qualify.
Boston's definitely a guilty pleasure.
Basically a pub rock band, right?
But it's basically a pub rock band. And I have the first two Boston albums on LP, and the second one, they're both sound amazing, but the second one is stunning. It's one of the best sounding records in my entire collection right now, which is not as big as Chris's probably, but is not tiny either. It's just got some
buying that when it came out in like 1981 or whatever.
Yeah, it's got massive bass, it's got screaming dynamics. It's just
I still have it.
Superbly cool. It's like, and if you listen to the digital transfer, it's thin. There's no bass. You can't hear any of the cool organ stuff. It's awful. It's awful to listen to. It's bright and harsh.
Yeah.
Another story from my record pressing days. There's a story, and I've forgotten the artist who was involved in this, so I apologize for that. Probably, it's good detail to add some validity to the story. But when we pressed this record, it was a new pressing of it, of course, and people buy it, and then the forum started lighting up how the pressing sucked, right? And there was a scratchiness and a couple parts on this one track, and people were calling the label and wanting their money back and things like that. And then so they went back and re-listened to it. That is the artist and we at the plant. And this was before my time when I was there. And what they realized was that on the new pressing, you could hear a guitar pick hitting the guitar a couple times that you couldn't hear in the original, but that was there in the recording. And so, the artist, I think, had to go on those forums to be like, no, actually, it's not a worse pressing, it's a much better pressing, and that's supposed to be there. You just weren't hearing it on the original crappy pressing. And it brings up a good point, which is everyone goes crazy. I could do an hour on record pressing myths. We could revisit that, but having worked there for a brief time, but everyone goes crazy over original pressings, but there's no reason to think that an original pressing is better than the second pressing or the eighth pressing. It all depends on, of course, things like the mastering, if we went back and did stuff. But the thing that I learned in a very real way working at a pressing plant is which pressing plant they used matters a whole lot. And in some big runs, and we were involved in some of these, during my time there. If you have a major artist who's putting out a record and they have to produce, upwards of six figure plus records, even, sometimes in the millions, one pressing plant is not doing that. And so they have to shift it around to different pressing plants, the 4 or 5 different pressing plants across the world might do that. And so even one pressing might be pressed by different people, and then also would be pressed by different shifts at a individual plant. And so anyway,
it's incredibly complicated, but it also adds kind of a cool like collector element to things, which I think a lot of people enjoy. And also then the quality of cut, and this is something that's quite interesting, is in talking to the mastering engineers that I know, it's sometimes easier actually to get a really good cut from a digital master, even if it was done all analog, to master digitally, because the way that you have to DS and the managing the stereo width and depth and things like that to get the groove the way they want it to be and the load and all that stuff, sometimes it's easier to do that with digital tools. It can be more precise. Analog, like all analog cuts, are hard to do, and you have to crank a ton of treble into it, and you have to do all these very fussy things. And so there's like a huge amount of art that goes into it at every stage of the process: the cutting, the mastering, the plant, the pressing, all of that, and it all matters, which is, I think, one of the things that's kind of exciting about the format, but also one of the things that I suspect a lot of people find very frustrating about the format too.
For sure. Well, I liken it to antiques, and people love antiques for all these all the same sort of what is it, sort of background things, right? You know, the piece of furniture, you know, it might have some, you know, chips in it, and it might not exactly be perfect, but, you know, people like it because of certain things. And one of those is provenance, right? You know, I could take a pen, and if I just took it out of my pocket and it's a regular pen, nobody would pay anything for it. But if I said, you know, this pen once belonged to whatever, Thomas Jefferson, you know, then that pen is all of a sudden worth something. And so it's part of that is the provenance of a record, the pressing, you know, how long it's been around, you know, whether it's signed, you know, the condition of it. So it's sort of like antiques. So if you like antiques and you can't understand the vinyl obsession, but you like antiques, that might be a way for you to understand the vinyl hobby.
Yeah. And if you look at Discogs, which is, you know, obviously a huge online database that's mostly about vinyl, you'll see all the different pressing plant variations on just about every record on there. You know, you can find out just from looking at the label or the dead wax where it was pressed, who mastered it, as we just kind of earlier talked about. Like, all those things are there. Most people don't think about it, and you shouldn't really have to if you don't want to. But there's obviously a difference in the way every plant deals with things, as well as every person along the line and how they deal with what they're doing, you know?
Yeah, the QC guy could have been having a bad day, and, you know, he just sent a lot of them through that the previous day when he was in a good mood, you know, he would have paid more attention to.
Yeah. You know, I do QC actually for one of the mastering engineers I mentioned to you, Chris, and he sends me a lot of, you know, vinyl QCs, and it's true. You know, sometimes, like, I was texting him yesterday, I was like, hey, Dave, is there like a funny crackly sound in the bass or something like that? And he was like, I checked with the artist and that's what they wanted. I was like, okay, that's, you know, that's what they want.
So, you know, with a stopwatch and note all the pops and clicks.
Oh yeah. It sucks. It's the worst. It's surprisingly, again, with digital, you don't have too many of those. As converters,
not much of a physical aspect to the process.
As converters have gotten better, that's gotten to be less of an issue. I actually sometimes notice there's more peculiarities in the analog ones, where, like, whether there was a tube fizzing or just a noisy resistor or something, it's like, man, why does the analog one sound like there's like some sort of funky noise going on it? And the digital ones are often cleaner. So it's interesting
how the tubes are always the problem.
Always blame
the tubes.
Always blame the tubes. That's right. You know, it's funny you say that, but I actually find tubes more reliable than some of the other parts. Sometimes I often find that resistors and capacitors are sometimes a source of my heartache more than tubes. Yeah. Tubes are surprisingly reliable.
It's going to kill the tubes
exactly.
Too.
Yeah.
They put them in fighter jets back in the day, you know.
So tubes react. You know this far better than I do. Tubes react in whatever system they're put in. Anyways, Nicholas, do you want to share some musical selections with us?
Yeah, sure. I have records sitting right over there.
I know Chris went like all like.
Yeah,
super.
I'm a very visual
prepared
person, so I brought visual aids.
I love it.
You're extremely prepared. And so I have a few thoughts about it. So I mean, I'm going early on in my life. My musical taste was, like many of us, was defined by my parents. And so I had an interesting musical history growing up. So my mother would play show tunes. My mother traveled a lot when she was young. She saw the original, presentation or production of My Fair Lady in London with Julie Andrews and Rex Harrison, I think. And so I can sing all the words to My Fair Lady and Godspell and a bunch of others, and we would go to the so. Show tunes were my early thing. And then on the other side, my father brought in the more folk side. Johnny Cash, there's a lot of Johnny Cash, a lot of Peter, Paul and Mary, you know, Simon and Garfunkel, all that stuff. And then by the time I got older, I had two older sisters. And so and I still have a bunch of those records that my dad gave me. And then my sisters, who are 5 and 6 years older than me, they went to college. And this would have been in the mid 80s. And so I got their mixtapes. So, you know, that's how you shared music back then. And so their friends would and so all of a sudden, you know, they went to college in Central Virginia, and, you know, have all these influences from, you know, friends in New York City or the West Coast. And then they would send these mixtapes home to me, and I would discover all this new college music. So, fast forwarding to middle school, I was no longer listening to show tunes. I would have been a super popular kid, even more popular than I was, singing My Fair Lady in the halls of Liberty Junior High School. In rural Virginia. And so, it was Billy Bragg, Lloyd Cole. There was one tape of like French New Wave that I'm still on the hunt for. I don't remember it, but back in the day, I could sing to all the words, even though I didn't know any of them. I did really poorly in French class, and so it was this college rock, English beat, all that sort of things, and then the Jam and Paul Westerberg and all his bands. So that was my middle school era. And of course, went through the, Led Zeppelin, hard rock era when I was in high school. And once I got into college, actually, end of high school and into college, because of my geography and the time. So I graduated high school in 1992 from outside of Richmond, Virginia. And that just happened to be the time when Dave Matthews Band was playing every Tuesday and Wednesday night at a club in Richmond, Virginia, and a club in Charlottesville, Virginia. And we went, and you paid $6, and we were 18. We couldn't even drink. We had the big X on our hand, and we were all in because it was this hometown band in 1992, and it just looked so different, right? And everything was. I mean, when you're 18, the world looks completely different anyway. But when you walk into a club, for probably one of the first times alone, not with, like an all ages show with your parents or sisters or something like that. And, you're on your own for the first time, you're feeling like, wow. And then you could really sense at that time, 91, 92, 93, Dave Matthews Band at that time, I mean, they were either going to go nowhere, which was unlikely given what you saw on the stage when you were there, or they were going to be huge. And they just looked so different, right? It was, 3 out of the 5 of them were Black. Boyd Tinsley with his, cowboy, cowboy hat and big and just theatrical violin playing, sort of like fiddle. It was incredible. And so that was a really exciting time. Got to know all those guys because of, various connections. It was a very small town world. I still know people that know all those guys. So that was really seminal for me in terms of, opening my eyes to, and who puts a saxophone and a violin in a band anyway. And so anyway, that lasted a few years, and, and as your musical tastes tend to, I fell out of that. I probably haven't listened to Dave Matthews Band in, I don't know, at least a decade. And, it has a stigma now. So, I can't admit it, but there's some good songs. And then, I started getting into jazz pretty heavily, I guess, probably around the time when I was more audiophile-y. And I'm a jazz trio I'm a sucker for a jazz trio, either piano based or guitar based would be my 2 favorites, even though I grew up playing saxophone. And so, but at this point, I'm such a new music junkie that I tend to, and because of streaming, and because my turntable is on the fritz and has been for a while, I just troll new music. And I'm trying to think of some things that recently. I mean, on the jazz tip, one I would seek out for people is, it's very short, but Kamasi Washington's. What would you call it? Soundtrack for the Michelle Obama biopic Becoming is gorgeous. It is just, I mean, it's not as experimental or, just full on as Kamasi's normal stuff, but at this time, it's the record that I put on to soothe my soul. It's like CBD in music form. It just, nice. It's just very, very calming. Just gorgeous, melodic. Unfortunately, because it's a soundtrack, many of the songs are like 1 minute and 45 seconds long, and the whole record is no longer than 35 minutes or so. But I could just put it on repeat, cook dinner, sit down on the couch, and just let the world, wash away a little bit. It's highly recommended for that.
Oh, he's amazing. I haven't heard that, but the Epic is definitely on my short list of LPs.
Yeah, his other work can be a little bit more challenging for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So I remember when the Epic came out, that was that there was a lot of us. I was in, when did that come out? 2014, 2015, 2016, maybe?
Something like that.
Somewhere in there, 2014, 2016, somewhere in there.
It's right here.
I was at Oberlin Conservatory. I was in college, music school at the time that came out. 2015. Okay. Yeah. So that was that era. And I remember when that came out, and there's a lot of us listening to that album. And it was popular in the, like, you know, conservatory kids are like, we play stuff all the time. And so we're always looking for like kind of like something different, like that felt really different. I remember that album, we were like, oh, this is cool. This is like all the textures and all the sounds are new. Like maybe not new, but they're different. They're combining sounds that haven't been combined before. And all the formal structure is, and the melodies and the harmonies are all like totally familiar jazz. But the way that they were being combined and the way he was writing, it was like, it felt like this really cool fusion of like all the classic and all the bebop and all the like homage. Like it wasn't like throwing all that out, it was paying homage to that. And yet it was also like with the really weird way that the choir is mixed in and his saxophone solos, which he just is unafraid to just go totally into just like,
the
like
spiritual jazz side of it is huge.
Yeah. It was a really interesting combo.
Barry Coltrane and Alice Coltrane, especially Pharoah Sanders, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it was like taking all of the intent and all the musical knowledge of going really complex and then actually scaling it down and making it very accessible, I think. So I think of it as very like accessible music, because we were all like, oh, this is like, to our ear at the time, we were all learning about like Schoenberg and crazy bebop and Ornette Coleman and stuff like that. So we're like, oh, this is like super easy to listen to, but it's like so good. But yeah, it is probably pretty out there for like your average audiophile jazz listener.
Yeah, I actually bought that record for my dad as a gift when it came out. Because I thought, you know what, he's really traditional. He's really into bebop and that kind of stuff and classical music. But he might like this. And he actually did. He liked most of it. So
yeah, I love Rerun Home on that album and the cover of Cherokee. The opening tune, Changing of the Guard, is just stunning. I don't know if you've seen a live performance of that, but he opens a lot of his shows with it. And he talks about the genesis of the song. And it's this very like spiritual, like lucid sort of dream thing that kind of occurred to him. But it's very moving. It's not just like jazz trio walks in, plays a bunch of stuff, and you're like, cool. There was a lot of notes, and some of them were really pleasant, and I don't really know what to make of it. He's very open. He feels very open and like very vulnerable about the process, which I thought was quite cool.
Non-intellectual jazz, right?
I mean, it's intellectual. Emotive. It's intellectual in the sense that like there's a lot of moving parts and things like that. It's very informed, but it's not. His band started performing on the West Coast when they were like 18 or 19. They were young. They were playing just clubs in, I can't remember if he was from the Bay Area or LA, but it was like they started as like a scrappy little band of youngsters, and kind of crafted this huge ensemble as they grew over the years. Very grassroots beginnings. So it was quite cool. And it reminded me a little bit in some ways of Blues and Roots by Charles Mingus, just the way that the album is crafted, in that it builds up these layers and builds up huge layers. And then it's all of a sudden, like with Monin, it goes to this place that's just absolutely insane and totally rocking out. And like, there's a total loss of structure, and yet everything still makes sense because everyone's just in the zone. And it was almost, it reminded me of that album a little bit, which is also one of my favorite albums.
Good point.
Nice.
What else you got, Nicholas?
So I mean, I'm thinking records now, like actual vinyl records. And, so I found out about, and this is somewhat controversial in some circles, but I love it. So there's this site called betterrecords.com or better-records.com. And they get written up because, in, the standard press, because someone, some reporter notices that they have a $750 copy of, some old album, and people freak out. But what they do is they buy a bunch of different copies, exactly to the point that we've been making. They buy a bunch of different copies of that record, play it on a really good system, like a $30,000 system kind of thing. They have some pictures of it on their website, or at least they used to. And then they only sell the top ones. And if they, maybe they bring in a dozen of them and none of them make the cut, and then they sell that at a premium. And they have ones that are in the, on sale. You can get 65, 75, and then they go on up. And like everything else in audio, you can spend as much as you want. And I've bought several of those albums that are important to me, and that I knew I wanted good copies of. And one of them that I've done a comparison with, because I had the old version of it, and I listened to it growing up. It's one of my favorite live albums. Is "Waiting for Columbus" by Little Feat. Mm-hmm. And now I'm on record, but saying that I am not a big Southern rock fan. Right? Like I don't. Normally, the Almonds just don't do much for me. My brother-in-law absolutely loves, the Almonds and that kind of thing. And who else would be in that ilk? But I love Derek Trucks. But anyway, but there's something about Little Feat and specifically Waiting for Columbus. And that album is just incredible. If you get a good copy of it, and I have a Better Records copy, and I have a whatever the copy I grew up with is, I haven't even checked, but I've compared them, and it's legit. And to what Grover was saying before, you can hear things, and you're talking about better imaging, and of course lower noise floor on the better pressings. And oh man, that album, if you're looking for, if you sort of have a bad opinion of live albums as far as their sound quality and what they bring to the table, get that. It's a double album, and you are there. The crowd noise is a great level on that record, and they've got percussion going on, and you can just really see the musicians, and they're just having a great time. And so Waiting for Columbus is one of those records that I love it.
Is that the one with a tomato in a hammock on the cover?
Yeah. I've actually, so what? My copy of that is at the shop, because I brought a few of those, solid pressings in, because we're testing some phono preamps and things. And we wanted to know that we were dealing with, the quietest records. Is that our phono preamp, or is that the record making that noise? And so I brought that, so I could break it out. But yeah, it's got a weird little cover.
Yeah, that's funny, because as you're talking about it, I'm picturing this thing in my head. When I was a little kid, I had the jacket to that album, but no discs. And it was just in my little bin of records that I had when I was, 10 or whatever it was. Sgt. Pepper's and blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
And whatever else. And I never heard the record. I've never, ever heard it. But I just remember the cover. And it was sort of like the text was it looked like maybe it was Japanese. Is that?
I don't know. I'd have to look at it. I don't, it's one of those things where I don't even look at it. It's like a street sign on your way home, like you don't even see the street sign anymore because you've seen it so much. It's sort of a maroon color. I know. And it does have, but I don't know. And maybe that's the pressing that you have as Japanese on.
Maybe. Yeah.
That's weird. But it's sort of Waiting for Columbus in a scripty thing. I think I could be totally wrong.
Strange
I
coincidence.
have a bad memory. Like I said, my phone, I offload everything. I offload my brain to my phone. So, I know what the record looks like when I go to find it. I don't need to describe it to you. Yeah. Let me see. That's probably about, that's all that's coming to mind, initially on, the Smiths were big for me growing up, and I've bought a few records. That was one of I remember, but everything was CD and tape for me growing up. I was born in '74, so when I was really diving into it, it was mid '80s, and it was all tape and CD. And I remember getting a few of those, and just you can't wear out CDs, but wearing them out.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Funny.
Yeah,
wow.
The Smiths are one of those bands for me too, and I had most of it on CD and some cassettes, but since then, and because of part of this, Johnny Marr remastered the whole catalog. They put it out all out on vinyl. I bought a bunch of them again on vinyl, and they're pretty damn good.
Really good. Yeah. That's good to hear. Yeah, I have Louder Than Bombs, which is their, sort of a compilation. Mm-hmm. And I think I remember it sounding not that great. But I buy a lot of records. I haven't had a working record player in a while, but I still buy records just to support artists, and one day I'll have one. And so
that's cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Was that it for you, Nicholas? Let's go on to Grover then.
Oh boy, here's where it gets exciting. Or not. Or just really obscure. So my dad was definitely like a rock, like headbanger kind of guy growing up. Like he was all into Zepp. And like not metal, but like he was down with some King Crimson and some like thrashy, like he was into hard rock, Guns N' Roses, Led Zeppelin, all that kind of stuff. He was Gen X, so it was, you know, he was more The Wall than like, you know, what's the Pink Floyd? I'm gonna date myself now. What's the Pink Floyd album? Dark Side of the Moon. Yeah, he was more The Wall than Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah, that was me too.
Me too.
You know, I think there's some angsty childhood.
Okay, let's bring your dad on here. Your dad would fit in better with me and Chris.
Yeah. He just turned 50 and like he's, you know,
yeah, totally.
He knows. He's like, you know, so I grew up with, you know, we had Vandersteens in the house and that kind of stuff when I was a kid.
Yeah. I had Vandersteen 2 CEs for many years.
Yeah. My dad had an old pair of original 3s, not 3As, not 3A SIGs, just 3s. And I think a McCormick amplifier. So yeah, he was solidly into the audio thing. I remember though, like I listened to all that as a kid, but I like it and it's cool, but I wouldn't say it like necessarily stuck more than anything else. What I remember, one of the first albums that I really remember as a kid, that's kind of on speed dial for me is Wishing Like a Mountain, Thinking Like a Sea by Poi Dog Pondering. I don't know if either of you.
I love that band.
Yeah,
I love that record. I saw them many times.
Oh, yeah. I saw them, live in Chicago because I lived in Chicago at that time.
Right. And they moved there sort of.
They started in Hawaii or something like that, and then they moved to Austin, and that was kind of where the main band formed with Frank and some of the other people, and then they've been in Chicago for a long time. So they're like local celebrities in Chicago. Their music is it's like the weirdest mix of like hard on the sleeve, strange techno, folk, singer songwriter stuff. Like it's all over the place. It's just this bizarre fusion of so many things. So that was a huge band for me growing up. It's very hippie. Yeah, it's very hippy dippy. Which probably
I remember a Poi Dog Pondering CD being in a stack that was sort of part of, you know, it's a stack of like 10 or 12 records that was at a friend's house that we'd put on while we were playing ping pong, like on the side, you know, screened in porch, and it was, you know, be in rotation with, you know, a bunch of those hippie-ish type of, you know, I think Rusted Root was always.
Yeah. That's the one. Yeah. Rusted Root, Poi Dog Pondering, some of the 90s Paul Simon albums, like Rhythm of the Saints and stuff like that were all kind of things that I grew up on, like sort of like weird hippie fusion music. And then there was kind of this other part of my musical life, which, you know, I was in band as a kid and I taught myself piano and was a musician, all this kind of thing. So I was exposed to all the like classical and jazz and all that kind of stuff. But then there was this other part of my musical education, which was, you know, like Spiral the Dragon soundtrack, which was done by Stuart Copeland. And that's how I discovered The Police, was because I loved Spiral the Dragon. I loved the soundtrack, and it's this weird, funky, like sort of reggae-y, grungy, funky soundtrack. And through that, I was like, there was a feature about Stuart Copeland making the music for it. I was like, who is this Stuart Copeland dude? And my dad was like, what do you mean, who is Stuart Copeland? He pulls out Synchronicity too, you know, and he plays it. And I was like, this is amazing. I love that. So that's like how I got into the Police. And then of course, like I watched an enormous amount of anime as a kid, and my mom is Chinese. So there was like all this other like Eastern music that didn't make, you know, that had like nothing to do with that. So it was like this weird mix of influences. And then when I was in, you know, high school and college, I got really into like Janelle Monae and Prince and like a lot of the funk music and like weird futuristic, like Afrofuturist music that really caught my ear. So it's been a weird mix of things for me. Janelle Monae's The Arcandroid album was a huge thing for me. Like I had been, it was in like between 8th grade and my freshman year of college, or freshman year of high school, I just like didn't listen. I hadn't like not been listening to anything. I just was in like in a phase where I just wasn't listening to music. And
how weird.
It was strange. I don't know. It was just like a funk where I was just like, everything didn't sound like, nothing sounded interesting to me. And then that CD came out and I found her, this was like early days of YouTube. I found a video of hers on YouTube, and the Arcandroid album was like, I think it was the first album I remember listening to as like sitting down and like audiophile style, like listening to the whole album through, like, because I grew up with the speakers and I grew up with the whole audiophile thing. My dad had kind of tried to teach me about it, but I was like, yeah, I'm like not really into this, you know. Like I got it, but I I didn't do it often. I like to put on Poor Dog Pondering and dance around the living room, you know, when I was a kid. So that was the album I remember was like, hey, Dad, can I use your stereo? And he was like, I mean, yeah. And then he was like, wait, what? And I put it in, and it's, you know, it's not headbanger music. It's pretty weird. He was like, this is cool. What is this? And that was, you know, I was like, oh, this is amazing. And I think Bandcamp had started either shortly before that. And so I started going on Bandcamp, listening to all this cool stuff. And that remains kind of a big source of musical discovery for me, is like really indie artists on Bandcamp. And then going to, oh, it's amazing. And you can support artists directly.
I spent more money on Bandcamp over the pandemic than all years prior.
Absolutely. So, and as a musician myself, like I've put stuff up on Bandcamp for free. And when people come and just like give you $5 for it, when you're like, it's free, that's like the most amazing feeling. So I always try to pay people, even if it's free, like it's just a few bucks.
PSA to all the musicians out there on Bandcamp. So I bought, one of the Bandcamp Fridays. I tried to save up, and buy on those days. And, it was one of the, middle of the summer ones. And I bought 4 or 5 albums that Bandcamp Friday. And I got an email back from one of the groups, and none of these are big groups, right? Mm-hmm. You're not buying, Taylor Swift on Bandcamp. And so it was this, this UK based, jazz pianist. And I had never heard of him, but I just found him through, discovery on Bandcamp, just like we're talking about. It's great. And I bought it on a whim. And, a day or two later, I got an email, and he just said, hey, Nicholas, thanks for buying this. And he's probably copying and pasting and sent it to all of them, but it didn't matter. Like that's not how it presents to me. And I got it as a very, it was very touching to me. And, I liked getting it. So all you artists out there, that's all you have to do. You just have to recognize us. You don't have to send us, you don't have to look at our Twitter profile and mention something specific about us. Just acknowledge us. I'm telling you, it's, you'll get, And I have then, so here's the example, right? I bought 5 or so other records. I couldn't tell you what other records, but I could tell you who this guy was. Mm-hmm. Right? Because he made that impression. And I've told other people that story. And so anyway, Dave Mulligan, I think is his name. I'll double check that. But again, memory.
Making that connection is huge. It's really important. And engaging with your audience, your community.
It's so easy
fans.
these
days. And it's easy, and that's the other thing too. Is it's really easy to do.
Especially this is what I don't understand. Sorry, rant. It's like I had this issue with art. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is where Nicholas never gets put on a guest list ever again, because you're the guy that anyway. So I had this thought when bands were touring, right? That what else are you doing all day, right? You're in a van, you're in a Subaru, you're driving from some god awful place to another god awful place, and you got nothing to do but reply to your fans on Twitter, Instagram, whatever. And then now you have zero excuse in the pandemic, right? We've all got more time. And so if you haven't been spending this time reaching out to every single person that mentioned you, hashtagged you, I don't know, you need a new manager or label or, marketing team or something.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's easy. It is. And it's very true. And actually one of the reasons I know someone who's a next door neighbor to Katy Perry and Orlando Bloom. And one of the interesting things about that she says about them is you would not believe how hard Katy Perry works. Not because, whether you don't like her music or not, or whatever you think of her, she works incredibly hard, and she talks to her fans on her social media directly and is in charge of the posts. And it's a lot of work. It's really hard. It's a full-time job, but she does it, and people who are Katy Perry fans notice and appreciate, and that's a big thing. Taylor Swift does a similar thing too, right? Is very engaged with her fans. Again, regardless of whether you like the music, she's very successful because people feel like they're connected to her.
Yeah, that's my daughter's a big Taylor Swift fan and has been for many years.
And they feel like Taylor likes them and feels like they're special and talks to them, and that's a huge part of her brand. And that's part of why she's so successful, is because she's very personable to her fans. I actually, side note, know the engineer who did her first album, and he has said nothing but really positive things about her.
Good to know.
So anyways, so then I went to Oberlin Conservatory, which was kind of an interesting culture shock for a variety of reasons. But musically, I don't know how much you guys know about Oberlin, but there's a big focus on really, really old historical music, like Baroque and pre-Baroque, like old music. And then there's also a huge focus on really weird modern music, like serialism and funky jazz and avant-garde, like ultra modern music. And we have the head of the music theory department there. They're known for having a really, really good music theory department. But the head of the theory department there studies this incredibly complicated post-Schoenberg, strange avant-garde classical music. And he's like the #1 scholar about this kind of music in the world. Like he's the dude when it comes to avant-garde, funky, modern music. And one of the things that he always talked about was hearing into music, like hearing what the musical context and the musical conceit of a piece of music was. He's like, even this really dissonant 12-tone music is actually beautiful if you pay attention to how it's working internally. And he taught us how to listen to that. And that, I think ever since, I've listened very differently to music. And I remember hearing Steve Reich's Music for 18 Musicians for the very first time. I don't know if you guys are familiar with minimalism at all, but it's basically the idea that you take a very small amount of musical material and you just repeat it over and over again. And it's based almost more on Eastern music, where it's like drone based and kind of like, you're supposed to like meditate and just kind of zonk out to it. And I remember hearing it for the very first time, and my mind was blown. It very much lined up. This was the first time when like music from like the Western Academy of Music had lined up with like how I had listened to the video game music of my childhood, which was like repetitive loops, really, really repetitive. Like they have to be loops that repeat so seamlessly that you don't notice they're repeating, but you are hearing the same thing over and over again, and it's supposed to just put you in a mood. Exactly right. You can hear that
in everyone's head.
Exactly, and you can hear that a million times, and it never gets boring or old, right?
And there's always a picture that comes along with it.
And there's always a picture, right? And the little coin, when
you're going underground.
Bing, bing, bing. Yep, exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. And I think part of the thing that's really interesting about that kind of music is that, and I listen to a huge amount of soundtrack music, like the Octodad soundtrack was something that really caught my ear recently, because it's this bizarre, like the premise of the game is that you're an octopus who's trying to pose as a dad for this like suburban family, and you have to try and pick things up and like go about your day doing like normal things, but it's really hard because you're an octopus and you're really clumsy.
Relatable.
And the soundtrack has this like funny little whistling theme, and then as you mess up and like drop things, there's these harpsichord like banging sounds that like will kind of accompany you, and it devolves the like worse you get at the game, and it kind of devolves into this weird discordant thing, and then it comes back to this like really cheery poppy like snaps and whistling kind of tune, and it's just so different and quirky. That album kind of caught my ear. The Black Panther soundtrack actually was another one that caught my ear. But listening to, I've been really fascinated, especially in the last couple of years, about how music that it's very repetitive sort of works and puts us in a mood, and the power of it to like kind of be either very relaxing or like to elicit strong feelings without necessarily almost feeling like it has a direction, which I think is very unusual and interesting. Mm-hmm. So Music for 18 Musicians was huge for me.
Yeah.
I would also say that I really like avant-garde music, which is very approachable and accessible. So Ambrose Akamusori, who is I think that's how you say his name, who is an incredible jazz player. He's
an Audeze artist, an amazing guy.
He's an Audeze artist. Yeah, I was so excited by that. He did a couple master classes at Oberlin, actually. And the thing I remember from hearing him play was that first of all, he's the most technically skilled, I think one of the most technically skilled musicians I've ever heard. Like he did things on a trumpet, and I'm a horn player and trumpet player, and I've heard a lot of people do a lot of different stuff, and I'm like, okay, cool. I felt like I knew generally what you could do on the instrument and what you could do in the realm of a jazz trio. I was like, I kind of understand jazz trios. I've played in them. I've heard a million of them. They're cool, but like I have this solved. I know what this is. He walked in and with a jazz trio did things I'd never heard. It wasn't even that I didn't think they were possible. It was, I hadn't even conceived of them being possible. And he played material that, unfortunately, I think his Live at the Village Vanguard album is the closest to some of the material I heard there, but I haven't heard him actually put most of the material I heard him play at those concerts on a recording, which I wish he would. But for me, his most impactful album is probably The I can remember the name of the song. It's kind of orchestrated, chamber orchestrated one. There's a song on it called "The Beauty of Dissolving Portraits." Oh, "The Imagined Savior" is easier to paint, which I think is his one or two albums ago. Yes, yeah. So it's a little different than his other ones. It's a little bit more. It's got strings and a little bit of a chamber orchestra, and there's like I think a bass clarinet and an oboe and some things like that. So it's got some woodwinds and strings in it rather than just being a jazz trio. It's stunning. I like I said, there's a song on it called "The Beauty of Dissolving Portraits," which is, I've played it at audio shows and there's no dry eyes in the room whenever I play it. It's just unbelievably gorgeous. And also technically, if you take I've listened to it more and more, and I realized probably on about the like 500th listen, I was like, whoa, what they're doing, the parts they're playing are incredibly hard to play and they sound totally seamless. It has no formal structure in terms of rhythm or melody or anything like that. It's all textural, but within being totally free and textural, it makes total sense. There's form, there's structure, there's a story to it, which is crystal clear. And to me, that's just like amazing. That's like, he went totally like as far out as you could go, and yet it still is organized in a way which is totally clear. And so that's something that for me was really impactful. That album was huge. Caroline Shaw, who's also another modern, she won a Pulitzer for classical music a couple years ago with it was actually a vocal band is what they call themselves, A Room Full of Teeth. And that album was really cool. And then she had a Attica Quartet album called Orange, which is very, very, very cool to me as well. It's like weirdly formally structured, but it's like a house being built in front of you is the only way I can describe it. So I love that kind of avant-garde classical music. And then I also like stuff like Tycho. Like Tycho did a Weather Remixes album this year, and I just thought it was great fun. It's really clean, sounds great audiophile wise. There's some fun singing on it, and it's just, he just does awesome beats. And
another recent Audeze artist.
Another recent Audeze artist. Well, there's a reason I've been reaching out to some of these people and been excited about some of them. So yeah, for me, it's a lot of different things, but I would say most of what I listen to nowadays is like, you know, I like to be challenged by that kind of avant-garde music that's like really also accessible. But then also a lot of video game soundtrack music. And I guess a lot of people call it IDM. So
intelligent dance music, right?
Intelligent dance music. Yeah. It's a little bit of a pretentious name, but
yeah,
you know, it's EDM that is kind of like a little softer, a little bit more slow in its pace, a little bit more
for headphones in the club.
Yeah. Yeah. You can sit down and like kind of, you know, just zone out to it or get into a nice mood or like relax into it. And it's got interesting things that pop out and it's not as repetitive maybe and things like that. And then of course, you know, as I mentioned, I'm really into like Afrofuturist music, like Janelle Monae and you know, some of the kookier Prince stuff that came. I actually like the last 2 or 3 albums Prince did, David Bowie, you know, some of his more experimental stuff I'm really into. So yeah, it's a wide mix, but that's more than 5, I know, but that's kind of just some stuff that I've been listening to lately. I troll Bandcamp a lot and Qobuz for new music suggestions.
You mentioned, you know, experimental and avant-garde music, and I think it applies to that, but it also applies in general to just new music and getting in touch with, you know, new music or listening to music that you might not be familiar with. And it goes back to the record thing that we talked about, and I think it's one of the things that's great about records, that, you know, you're learning about something about the process in many cases, right? That's also one of the things that's great about Qobuz and Rune, frankly. You know, Qobuz, you know, links to a PDF of the liner notes or, you know, whatever's packaged with it that has it. And then Rune has it, you know, built in, and you can learn about it. But it brings up, so do you all know the etymology of the word empathy?
I looked this up once.
So it was, so it comes from a German word that was coined by a guy named Robert Vischer, and he was an art critic. And this is is a collapsing of the history of this word, but the word is called Einfühlung. And it literally means into feeling or into the feeling in German. And it came about when the shift from art, or around the time when the shift from art went from representational art. So I'm a king or a noble, draw my family, paint my family and make it look like us, and to more impressionistic art. So when you have representational art, it's very easy to tell whether it's good or not, right? Anyone can look at it and say like, yes, that is, the queen and I, because I'm the king in this story. And it's easy for art critics or for anyone to sort of judge that art, but it's harder. How do you look at an impressionistic painting and understand what's going on and judge it? And so you have to get into the feeling of the artist. And I think that's key. I expand that out to say, what's the historical context, what's going on in the world, what's going on with that person, did they just get through a divorce? Did their parent die? Did they, coming off an addiction problem, whatever it is, and learning about the music can help you, and putting it into context. And you used that word, I think, in the beginning, Grover. Putting it into context is, especially with music that the first time you hear it, you don't understand it. So, if you get a recommendation from someone whose taste you respect, and you sit there and you say, I can't get into this. I don't understand this. I don't know what to do with this. These noises that are coming into my brain. I always encourage people, learn more about it.
Yeah.
Dive into the liner notes or whatever you have. Google it and then find out what's going on.
Absolutely. And it's interesting for me because I do some work on, film and game soundtracks, and some work in, the more popular mainstream music industry. And I try to incorporate elements of that into my musical life. But like, I also do just have to listen to a lot of pop music and a lot of what we would consider conventional to Western eras music nowadays. And so that's like almost my musical guilty pleasure, is stuff that's really challenging, right? Because I'm like, I don't want to feel like I want the sense of surprise there. I actually have some friends who started a startup called Secret Chord Labs, which basically attempts to sort of quantify why music is successful. And part of the neuroscience behind it is they found that around the world, this is true, which is very unusual for anything psychological or musically related. But they found that a sense of surprise, right? Building expectations and then surprising those expectations is a key part of a lot of why we like the music that we like, regardless of genre. Mm-hmm. And so for me, part of that was, my training was like, hey, we're going to listen to this music that on first listen sounds awful, or like is maybe not terrible, but it's like, it doesn't make sense to us, right? It doesn't do what we expect music to do. And I love that sense of, discovery of the process, or like hearing inside something that you don't quite get after a couple listens is such a fun experience. Like, I get it now. That's super cool. It's the same. I think for me, it's the same thing that comes from like, oh, these new speakers, like I totally heard a thing in the soundstage there that I didn't hear before. It's that same sense of excitement. And so that's something that I like. I love it.
Yeah.
It's another good thing.
The shock of the new.
The shock of the new. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
It's a good band name
really
too.
Don't like that.
Yeah.
But people I think the three of us are kind of all in the same boat. Like, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. There's people that go to, like name an artist, like Eric Clapton or, some artist like that. And you go to there and there are people that only want to hear the hits. Mm-hmm. Right. And there are people there that, want to hear the new album because they've already heard the hits a million times. And yeah, I'm definitely on the play your new stuff, and sure, close with Layla or whatever, but do what you have to do. But yeah. I want to hear, I want to know that your musical, mm-hmm. Creative juices are still flowing and it's not just a retirement tour.
Yeah. And I also love that, especially in the vinyl world, we're seeing a lot more world music, that there was a Madjar album that came out a year or two ago. Excuse me. That was, and Madua Mokhtar also came out with an album, and they are Tuareg music. It's like Tuareg music mm-hmm. that's like, nomads in the desert playing cool stringed instruments, but then they also grew up listening to like Jimi Hendrix cassettes. So they have these just like, Yep. The Madua Mokhtar album is awesome. And he's like, I went to a concert of his actually in Chicago shortly before I moved to LA. And he has all the Tuareg stuff and it's really cool. But also in the middle of the concert, he just breaks out into this like Hendrix, Grateful Dead style, crazy, shreddy jam sesh. And it's mm-hmm. the weirdest fusion of those two things, but it works so well. And like his music is, it's not like Rihanna or whatever, but it's like pretty mainstream at this point for people who are, kind of interested in in that kind of music. And it's like so easy to get access to it now. It used to be that this stuff was like, you were lucky if you got like bootleg cassettes when you were traveling in, you know, Johannesburg. And now it's like, you can get it on Kobas or, you know, off of, you know, LPs off the internet or whatnot, which I love. I just love that there's so much accessibility to all that weird world music now.
That's another thing about musicians that I think, you all know a lot of musicians, obviously. I know a handful, and so imagine, you know, an artist, you know, like a country artist does a collaboration with a, you know, a rap artist or a, you know, some other type of artist. It doesn't matter what the two genres are. And everybody sort of freaks out and it's like, oh, you know, can you imagine, you know, Garth Brooks and, you know, Jay-Z or whatever. And what you realize when you talk to musicians is that they're not listening to their own music, and they're likely not listening to a whole lot of music in their genre, right? You know, they tend to be musical omnivores, and they're looking for those different creative inputs. And so I think, you know, it's like, it's not all that surprising, you know, because these guys are getting flooded with music, and it's really only the fans that are locked into like, I only listen to jazz, or I only listen to rock, or I you know, the joke that we make all the time is around, you know, because everyone says, when I talk to customers and I ask them one of the common questions when I'm trying to suss out, you know, what gear would be right for them or whatever, what do you listen to? And it's invariably, I listen to everything except country and rap, and, you know, so it's just funny.
You know, and it's funny. I have two stories, short stories about this, but one is that, you know, genre basically really only tells you how stuff is mixed at this point, mixed and mastered, right? You know, generally that if you're going to get a classical album, it's going to be not too much compression, right? And it's not going to be super loud, right? Generally, you know that, right? Or if you get metal, you know that it's going to be bright and it's going to be pounding, you know, and stuff like that. But genre was invented just to categorize and sell the music. It wasn't really, you know, it has no connection to the actual process of making it, really.
Right. What does it mean if you say I don't like jazz? You know, I mean, like look at the range of what jazz or rock or anything is. You know,
and most
like saying I don't like food.
Yeah. And it's, you know, most metal musicians, for example, right, are incredibly well educated musically. Like they listen to a lot of classical, they listen to a lot of pop music, they listen to a lot of funk, like they listen to a lot of, you know, most of the metal musicians I know are very broad. And the same is true of like the acid jazz crowd, right? They grew up listening to the jazz records that their parents played on. And that was how, you know, a lot of early, you know, what became EDM, but started out as kind of like, you know, trance and things like that started was from jazz. It was from the kids of people who were making jazz records. And then kind of also
little snippet of bass,
they heard this little snippet and they're like,
to just hear that over and
cool.
over again.
I want to hear exactly. They found it catchy and then they looped that and
like
all of a sudden you have a new thing. Exactly. Right. And it put them in the zone. And they didn't need all the solos to put them in the zone. They got the drum loops to put them in the zone. Kind of actually going along with that thought, I had a Mabira. There was a pretty famous Mabira player who came to school when I was in college and did a workshop with us. And Mabira is like a little thumb piano from Central and Eastern Africa. And he was teaching us how to play and talking about, you know, the culture behind it and how, you know, what kinds, like he didn't really play concerts, but like what kinds of concerts and how he toured and all that kind of stuff. And it was totally different from all the things we think about. The one thing that stood out to me though, was we asked him like, so what's on your Spotify? And he's like, I mean, what is Spotify? You know, and we're like, well, what do you listen to? Like when you listen to music? And he's like, what? And we're like, you know, when you have like recorded music. He's like, oh, you know, like we have cassette tapes. Sometimes we record ourselves playing and we put them in the boombox and we sit around and we reminisce about that night. And it was like really fun. And we're like, yeah, but like what music do you listen to like in your free time? He's like, what? And we realized after kind of questioning him more that he didn't listen to music like on his phone and he had a phone and he had, you know, computer and all that kind of stuff. He didn't listen to music in his free time, like just as a pleasurable activity. For him, listening to music was like, hey, I took like some recordings that had my phone, or like we put a cassette in a tape, you know, in a boombox, and I would sit around with my mates and we would be like around the fire playing and we'd be listening a little bit and we'd be like, hey, remember when you did that thing? Or remember when so-and-so got so drunk that night? Or like, and for them, it was like looking at old photographs. And that was the way that, you know, we kind of figured out how to like understand it, was like they would pull out recordings and be like, oh, hey, like remember so-and-so, that was so great when we had a great time that night. But it wasn't like they listened to music as like they're like, no, we don't listen to music to like relax or have fun or part. They're like, what? And for them, it was also like, if you have a party, like we pull out our bureaus and our drums and we play and we make a party, you know? So it was a totally different mindset about how to listen and what recorded music meant. And that's always kind of stuck with me as like you know, what you were saying, Nicholas, like context. Like some people have totally different contexts around music. And I think the discovery of that for me is, again, part of the joy. It's like, you know, it goes hand in hand with the audiophile bit of like, oh, cool, I heard something new in a record I didn't hear. I heard I heard the bass in a way I hadn't heard it, or things like that. And it's like, oh, wow, that's like an instrument I've never heard before. Like, oh, that's a really weird, like voice leading thing, or like, oh, there's really cool, I can hear like a really cool structure going on there, or you know, whatever. And for me, that's like one and the same.
That's another good thing, going back to the vinyl. Like, what's good about vinyl? The name of this video. Why you should why you should like vinyl is I mean, this is not a new thought, but I'm throwing it out there. That it's sort of like, you know, getting a gym membership. You're bought in, right? You've paid money for this record, and so you're going to give it a little. You know, you're sort of, you know, beholden to giving that a little bit more attention. Yeah. And then just the simple fact that you have to get up off your, you know, lazy butt to turn a track off means that, you know, you'll listen to that track and get to the next one and maybe give it more of a chance than you would if it was on, you know, Tidal or, you know, Spotify or whatever, and you could just
encourages participation.
Well, and
growers, not showers, right? I mean, yeah.
You can't skip tracks either is the other thing. So you're going to hear those deep cuts that you would normally skip on the regular album. And that for me has been a source of discovery of some bands that I was like, oh, I knew this band, but I never listened past like I skimmed the track, but it's just different. You know, you don't get to skip it. And I put on vinyl even as background music. I don't always sit down and like focus on vinyl. Sometimes it's totally background music. But in that case, I find that, you know, the bass, because vinyl has a lot more bass, and the way that the highs are not annoying totally change it. It's like, it's better as background music sometimes than digital, because you don't have to futz around with the digital or, you know, try and cue something up. You're like, no, you just throw on the record, you forget about it. And it's like totally like tranquil. And sometimes the digital is either frustrating because it's not working, or it's like, man, that's like kind of annoying, or like you're just skipping tracks that you don't want to hear. And I think there's something, I very much, this is just life philosophy. I'm always trying to push myself and be a better person and learn more and work on self-enrichment. And I find that listening to music that I don't always, for me, that's as a musician, as a music lover, that's an expression of like, I'm trying to like push myself. I'm trying to like learn more. I'm trying to be open to new ideas. And sometimes hearing those deep cuts that I was like, this doesn't like hit my, you know, immediate pleasure dopamine release receptor within 2 seconds is, you know, maybe it's not building great character, but I like to think that it helps me to be a little more open-minded.
It's good brain training.
It's good brain training. Yeah. Yeah. It's like a small thing, but that is something I think about and that I've noticed again, I'm a total vinyl newbie, but in the process of learning about it, that's one thing that I've noticed as well.
I used to support came up with a half joking idea of using vinyl as a time management technique. So have you heard of the Pomodoro technique, which is, you know, you work in 15-minute stints.
Oh, yep.
And you have a little timer, and then, you know, you work for 15 minutes, a focus work for 15 minutes, and then the timer goes off and you take a 5-minute break, and the timer goes off again, and then you're back to 15 minutes. Well, what's 15 minutes? Most sides of records, give or take, if they're not the annoying 45 RPM 12 inchers. Another
45 sounds so good.
I have other rants you'll be surprised to hear. So you put the side of the record on, you work, and then the music stops. And, you know, in most turntables these days, you actually have to get up and, you know, take the needle off, and so that little will annoy you and tell you that your timer is done, and then flip the record over and work for 15 minutes. So, you know, the vinyl record time management productivity technique. I need to come up with something catchier than that.
That's funny. I like that.
That's a good one, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is cool. So I have another call at 1 p.m. So I'm going to have to call to conclusion. Any final thoughts? I had a huge blast. This was amazingly cool. Thank you, guys.
This was great. And I really feel like, wow, obviously we more than doubled the time we intended to talk.
I know.
And I feel like we could just continue all day long.
Yeah.
We didn't, I mean, not that I wanted to, but we didn't talk about gear at all, which is great.
Right.
No, I mean, I legitimately think that. I mean, like I've talked to Gerber about this, I presume this is not going to go on the YouTube video, but I don't want to talk about my gear on these things.
Yeah, we do that all day long, right? Like,
right. We always talk about gear.
If this does make it on the video, if you're interested in linear tube audio, lineartubeaudio.com, call me. I'll tell you everything you need to know.
I'll link their website in the description box on our YouTube channel video. So no worries.
These are Audeze headphones. That's LTA gear in the background. That's all you need to know. Bye.